Have you ever wondered why we're so obsessed with who's in charge? I mean, really thought about it? Well, today we're exploring the invisible forces that shape human behavior and, honestly, our entire society. Welcome to this explainer, where we unpack the fascinating source material behind the primordial architecture of human authority. We're going to look at where our deep-seated relationship with authority actually comes from and why it is absolutely hardwired into the fabric of human existence. Let's get right into it.
Okay, let's dive into this by looking at a pretty fascinating paradox. Ask yourself, why do we instinctively want to protect small, helpless children, yet the moment they grow up, our attitude completely changes? Think about it. When kids become adults, we just don't care for them in that same protective way anymore. In fact, we often start viewing them as competition, or even as a threat. Why is that? Well, the source points out that humans actually begin to view their fellow humans negatively the exact moment they step outside the jurisdiction of our authority and control. Wild, right?
Chapter 1. The Roots of Authority, specifically looking at the parent-child dynamic.
You know, we often think of authority as this purely political construct, like governments and laws. But it's actually an instinct rooted deeply in the crib. It all starts with a psychological structure, a psychogenic mechanism, if you will. Human children are incredibly dependent on their parents for a really long time. And this prolonged dependency isn't just some biological footnote. It forms the primordial bond that sets the fundamental baseline for all human interaction moving forward.
From childhood onward, we're completely accustomed to parents asserting themselves. Authority is literally the tool parents use to impose their values upon their children. Because of this, authority becomes a deeply familiar presence in our personal development. We learn it in every single interpersonal relationship right from our youth. And this early exposure, it shapes everything. It dictates whether we grow up to respect authority, rebel against it, or feel this intense need to impose it ourselves. Basically, we have a fundamental affinity for authority simply because it's what we know best.
Let's move to Chapter 2 and see how this builds, from families to empires, mapping out the evolutionary arc.
So let's scale this up and trace how this concept grows from the intimate family unit to the wider world. It's kind of like a giant ladder. Step 1, we have that primary parent-child reproductive bond. Then in Step 2, small early communities use this exact same dynamic to transmit essential values and experiences from generation to generation. But as human society developed into Step 3, large cities, forms of high culture, massive empires, this primary connection had to be extended. It pushed way past the immediate community to a national and even global level. And finally, reaching Step 4, we see the structure projected onto the absolute ultimate heights, abstract gods and overarching ideals.
Now you might be wondering, why did that evolution even happen? Well, as societies expanded into these massive empires, a literal parent was no longer enough to maintain order. The extended environment desperately needed symbolic figures that held a position similar to a parent. So, to justify this massive scale of authority, grand societies turned to gods and to unifying shared ideals. If you look at the evolution of great faiths, you'll see gods becoming increasingly abstract and all-encompassing as societies grew from tiny communities to sprawling empires. But beneath the whole shebang lies one essential, unavoidable concept: authority.
Moving right along to Chapter 3, Authority versus Power, the Engine and the Fuel.
Now, what's really interesting about this concept is a critical distinction we need to make. Notice how these two ideas, which we normally treat as the exact same thing, are actually completely separate. On one side, we have authority. That's the structural mechanism. Think of it as the engine. On the other side is power, and that's the fluctuating resource or energy that sustains that mechanism. It's the fuel.
Authority is the mechanism. Power is the resource or the energy that sustains it. This quote beautifully summarizes the dynamic. And why does this distinction matter to us? Because it explains the actual mechanics of our social world. It totally explains why we sometimes see a leader, a parent, or a huge institution completely lose their authority while someone else suddenly gains it. The structure of authority didn't just vanish. Rather, the underlying energy of power, the resources, the situational leverage, the shifting life factors, well, it decreased for one person and increased for another.
This maps out exactly how the mechanism scales up. The structural geometry of authority remains identical, absolutely identical, regardless of size. In a family home, the dominator is the parent and the dominated is the child. Now compare that to historical society, which is famously built on the interdependent contrast of master and slave. The labels change, sure, but the structural ladder is exactly the same. From these foundational structures, all hierarchical ladders in historical class struggles are essentially extracted.
And underpinning this entire game is what's called the will to power. Now, this isn't just about logic or reason. It is a primal, biological, and psychological drive to assert oneself. It's this innate life force driving individuals to exercise their position, whether they're navigating life as the dominated or acting as the dominator. This fundamental system lies right at the base of all conflicts and wars, from the micro-interpersonal level all the way up to the macro-geopolitical level.
Which brings us to Chapter 4, the illusion of rebellion, and our inescapable structures.
This brings up a final and honestly perhaps the most provocative idea. We often really like to think we can escape or dismantle authority. But the reality? Authority persists even when we actively try to tear it down. It has such incredibly deep roots in our mental structure that it extends into completely unverifiable and immaterial forms. Whether we're talking about classical and modern stoicism, deep religiosity and piety, strictly analytical and scientific visions of the world, or even explicitly anti-authoritarian political positions, all of these, believe it or not, contain inherent aspects of authority within them. Even in philosophical aspects that position themselves against authority, it appears in one form or another. So the crucial point here is this: you literally cannot just opt out of the architecture of authority. Even when authority is heavily contested, even when it's labeled as unjust oppression or the source of great injustices, those very rebellions and accusations are in themselves viewed as a manifestation of authority.
So, we're left with a pretty powerful conclusion from the source. Without this inescapable structure, social order just cannot exist. Without it, human morality cannot function. Without it, humanity could not aim for something higher than itself. Authority is perhaps the absolute most characteristic essence of humanity. I mean, almost every origin narrative related to early humans touches upon some conflict of authority. It's the invisible architecture shaping every single context of our daily lives.
And that leads to a question I want to leave you with today. Now that you can see the engine and the fuel and those deep primordial roots reaching all the way back to the parent-child dynamic in the crib, take a look around you. What invisible authorities and what unseen hierarchical ladders are shaping your own daily life right now? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the structures around you.